Let me tell you about the Middle Branch in Baltimore. The first thing that you probably want to know is what the heck is the Middle Branch in Baltimore? If any of you are familiar with Baltimore, then you're almost certainly familiar with Baltimore's Inner Harbor. But few people understand that the Inner Harbor is really the northwest branch of the Patapsco River, which is a tributary of the Chesapeake, and that Baltimore is a Chesapeake city. And if any of you are from central Maryland, the Washington, D.C. suburbs, you probably love to go hiking at Patapsco Valley State Park. But almost nobody understands that that is really the southern fork of the Patapsco River, and that in between is the Middle Branch, Baltimore's forgotten waterfront, a forgotten water body in a forgotten section of a largely forgotten city. The Patapsco is a critical part of Baltimore's port economy. Baltimore is one of the largest ports in the country, and the Middle Branch is clearly right in the heart of all of that. What that means is that we have, in exchange for jobs and economic growth, we have divided our neighborhoods from their own waterfront, from one another, and from the surrounding region. In fact, we've created islands of neighborhoods which are spatially and physically, and in many cases, racially segregated from one another. And these become then forgotten neighborhoods in a forgotten region of a forgotten city. But yeah, this is a landscape with incredible assets, great opportunities. We have a surprisingly robust natural environment, not a hardscape bulkheaded shoreline, but a largely soft shoreline. We have signature architectural moments like the Hanover Street Bridge. We have a surprisingly robust network of trails that we've been building over the course of the past 20 years. And most importantly, we have the neighborhoods themselves, which are largely, though not exclusively, minority, largely, though not exclusively, low income. These are communities that simply want the access to and use of and benefit of their waterfront in the same way that other neighborhoods, professional class neighborhoods on Baltimore's Gold Coast would expect to have. To use that waterfront for their own cultural and economic benefit as an asset to them, which is why we say that the Reimagine Middle Branch project is not just a capital project with environmental justice elements, but fundamentally an environmental justice project, which also has capital elements. The neighborhoods and their long-standing intergenerational environmental injustice burdens come first and foremost in this work. Let me take you back and give you a little bit of history about the Middle Branch. If you go back to the early 1800s, you can see the early navigational maps present a very different landscape from the image that I showed earlier. A crinkly, very classically Chesapeake environment with lots of intertidal zone, lots of marshes and wetlands, lots of mud flats, lots of tributaries on tributaries in fractal geometry, as you would expect. Moving forward in time, you begin to see that development is encroaching from the north as the Baltimore port economy explodes and development begins to move south towards the Middle Branch. And you get to the beginning of the 20th century and you see that we are engineering a radically new landscape. All the green areas are areas that have been filled in to make way for new shoreline uses. And you can see also a huge amount of dredging is being done as we convert this to an industrial waterfront. By the 1970s, you've got a fundamental transformation of the entire area into a massive industrial port. The Port Covington area, which you see on your right, was the easternmost terminus of the Western Maryland Railroad, bringing goods into and out of America via this water body. And on the left bank, the Western Shore in Westport, there were major facilities like the Carl Lowry Glass Factory, one of the biggest glass bottle manufacturers in the country. Over the course of those several hundred years, we went from having 3,000 acres of wetlands to barely 10% of that. And of that, what remains are just, frag clinging to fill. So we've had a profound ecological impact. And that extends to all the other things you would expect from urban stream syndrome. All of the classics are here. We've got erosion and escarpments. We've got invasive species. We've got floatable trash. We've got phosphorus and nitrogen and suspended sediment. We've got everybody's here. And what we're doing right now in real time is transforming this landscape from Baltimore's forgotten waterfront into Baltimore's next great waterfront with 11 miles of parks, trails, environmental restoration, resilience, and economic development wrapping all the way around the water body. And we've got a huge, very detailed Reimagine Middle Branch plan, which we recently adopted by the city of Baltimore. There are far more elements in this than I'm able to go into today, but let me give you some quick highlights. This work really breaks down into two big scopes of work. The first is the upland parks, trails, and community development work, where we want to have a network of world-class parks stitched together into the community so that the neighborhoods have high quality, immediate access to and ownership of that waterfront, and then connected to the larger park shed. So we're getting away from the shoreline into the surrounding assets of the entire Middle Branch area. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. This is the area where the South Fork of the Patapsco empties into the main stem. To the left is the African-American neighborhood of Cherry Hill. To the right is the formerly white, now very mixed neighborhood of Brooklyn. In between is the Patapsco, very narrow and channelized. But if you look back in history, you realize that this was not a narrow channel. This was a deltaic estuarine environment. This was a big, wide river mouth with reeds and birds and islands, and an island that was called Reed Bird Island. And if you go to the 1904 Olmsted Plan for the Parks of Baltimore, it's very clear this is a huge opportunity. We should be protecting this waterfront and using it as a greenway to connect us to the surrounding region, which is why what we did is we built an incinerator there, and we put the incinerator right next to a Black neighborhood on purpose, and right next to little bits of a pool and a little ball field, which the neighborhood had fought hard over decades to be able to get. And as members of my board have told me, they grew up with moms calling their kids in because the ash was beginning to rain down on their heads. And we would use that ash to fill in the wetlands. Classic Baltimore story. Here's from 1962, a letter to the editor from the great Madeline Murphy, a community organizer, community leader in Cherry Hill, saying, we were promised 10 years ago that the incinerator would be removed, that we would have a really nice, pretty park, and that there'd be investment here for the community. And would you expect to do the same thing in rich white neighborhoods like Homeland and Guilford? Well, 60 years later, almost to the date, we finally make good on those long unkept promises. We created the $25 million Middle Branch Fitness and Wellness Center, a waterfront recreation complex with indoor and outdoor pools, indoor and outdoor basketball courts, indoor and outdoor jogging trails. It comes along with a $3 million turf field with lights on the water. Now suddenly the proud African-American neighborhood of Cherry Hill has a nicer ball field for its sports teams, and the wealthy professional class neighborhood of Federal Hill across the water. These are big, profound changes that we're creating right now. And we have a range, we probably have 15 different major park improvements underway right now. I would just point out this one, which is I'm very fond of. In the Pigtown neighborhood next to Carroll Park, there was a rec center that had been shuttered for 20 years. Literally no one had been able to use it from the community for the past 2 decades. We finally got inside and it was filled floor to ceiling with garbage. We're now investing $3 million in renovating, rebuilding, and reopening this so that there will be a quality public facility for young people for the first time in a generation. And of course, that programming is really important because particularly in an urban environment, an empty park is a dangerous park or a scary park. And we want these things to function both as ecological opportunities and as social opportunities. So we're funding about $500,000 a year in youth sports, along with all kinds of other great programming. Programming that includes everything from kayaking and canoeing and crew to gymnastics and football, getting people out in their communities, enjoying their parks, leading active, healthy lifestyles. Other things we're working on, we have a brand new park that we're in the process of designing. There's a developer working on a big new development on the Westport shoreline. He's agreed to carve off 8 or 9 acres to create a huge linear park that we're now in the design process for, making sure that the community of the existing community of Westport is first and foremost the most important people to decide what happens at that park. As part of that waterfront, there's going to be a brand new memorial to the Baltimore Black Sox, one of Baltimore's incredible Negro League baseball teams. There's an amazing history of athletic genius in South Baltimore, primarily, though not exclusively, African-American genius, which has been completely overlooked and ignored. Many of these players have their names up on the wall in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame, but they are unknown locally. We're going to change that and put proud South Baltimore history front and center in the middle of this ecological restoration. And then I would point out over here, this is the old Middle Branch Marina, privately owned marina, which has been now taken over by a Black-led environmental organization, the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative, or EDGI, who, in addition to helping young people become the journalists telling their own story of environmental injustice in their own neighborhoods, has partnered with many major academic institutions to begin doing citizen science and research that engages the community and helps them become experts in their own environment. That's the first half of this work. The second half of this work is the ecological restoration along the shoreline, restoring the lush intertidal zone, which is so classically Chesapeake, and using that for education, for resiliency, for trails and transportation. And we call that Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative. That's our shoreline implementation work. And I'm very excited to say that this big, bold, exciting project is well underway, with $53 million worth of funding already secured for our first stage of work. That first stage is going to be, here's what we're going to get to eventually over the coming decade or so. Right now, we had a big announcement of the first $48 million, and then immediately raised another $5 right after that to work in these 2 locations. The top one being BGE, next to BGE Spring Gardens, which is a big utility facility right on the water. And the second is at the bottom of the screen, MedStar Harbor Hospital, a really important regional hospital located on a peninsula, waterfront peninsula, where there are only 3 points of ingress and outgress, 2 of which are bridges, and their helicopter landing pad is in the flood zone. Both of these are high priority places that are subject to ongoing and increasing flood risk. And we are now spending our first $53 million to build a complex of wetlands and vegetated berms to insulate and protect these facilities, to provide restored intertidal habitat, and to create amazing recreational amenities that then become the foundation for community-based economic development. And here is a video showing what this is all going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years. You can see the wetlands wrapping around Harbor Hospital as we come down towards formerly overbuilt roads, which are now much more better designed with streetscaping for pedestrian crossings so that people can actually get to their own waterfront. Here we're beginning to approach the existing Middle Branch Park, a large and lovely park where we're going to be making significant improvements in the coming years, starting first and foremost, quite obviously, with making it physically possible for people to cross the road to get to it, as opposed to having to drive there from the neighborhood across the street. You can see significant trail improvements, landscaping improvements. As we approach the event lawn, this is a space where we have an annual 4th of July celebration organized by the Cherry Hill community, the Cherry Hill Arts and Music Waterfront Festival, that attracts thousands of people to the waterfront. We eventually want to make that tens of thousands of people and create more opportunities for people to gather across the year for concerts and other public events. Coming back from the other direction at the same park, you can see we have an existing small boathouse, which is now overwhelmed with the number of people who want to be able to use the water. So we need to be able to expand that dramatically. We want to then create really inviting, engaging, exciting recreational amenities for family that take advantage of the natural hillside. And then working your way down through a landscape of native trees, we want to make sure that there are things that make the parks more functional, including shade, which for those of you familiar with Baltimore in the summertime, it is not hospitable to human life. And so we want to be able to extend the amount of time that people can safely and happily spend near the water. And then we want to make sure that there are access points so that people can get out over on top of and into the water through a lush landscape of restored wetlands that protect the shoreline, to filter stormwater, and provide the habitat that is critical, particularly for juvenile species, to flourish. So that, in short, is the Reimagine Middle Branch plan. I've only hit highlights because there's not very much time and I want to leave time for questions and comments. So I will turn it over now to you to ask me anything you want to talk about.
We've got a couple questions rolling in. Sure, here's the first one. So can you pop in the video link of this amazing project that you showed? So yeah, all of the presentations will be available that you can watch later. And so next question is, so after you're building all of this, how would you keep it up? How do you maintain it?
Yeah, it's a great question, a critical question. So let me step back for a second and first explain my organization and what we do. South Baltimore Gateway Partnership is an economic development authority funded by about $8 or $9 million a year in casino revenues. When slot machine gambling was legalized in Maryland, the law said that a fraction of the revenues generated had to come back to the neighborhoods near our casinos in order to improve those neighborhoods. So they weren't just bearing the burden of having a casino in the neighborhood, that they would actually be beneficiaries of that. So I receive about $8 or $9 million a year. And as you can tell from the scale of what we're doing, I've been working very hard to leverage those funds to bring in state, federal, local, private, philanthropic dollars to work at the scale that we're achieving right now. Over time, what I anticipate happening is once we have gotten the lion's share of this built, my budget will shift more towards long-term maintenance and management, and that I'll be spending less time leveraging new capital projects and more time and energy supporting programs and maintenance. But that's something that we absolutely are working on, and I should say that it's probably going to be a group effort where, for example, that new park we're working on in the Westport neighborhood, the developers agreed that their HOA is going to fund the maintenance for that park, even though the park will be deeded to the city. So I think it's going to be a patchwork of different sources as we try to put all of it together.
Cool. So here's another question for you. It says, will this project introduce more job opportunities for individuals within the city that will want to work on this project and see it through?
Great question. So yes, what we want to make sure is that, again, as an environmental justice project, we want to ensure that the communities themselves are direct beneficiaries of this work. And that can mean having youth programs for football or crew or, or kayaking, but it can also mean career opportunities. And so what we're bringing together are a couple of different things. One, a number of largely Black-led or minority-led nonprofit organizations that are trying to work in the space of using the Middle Branch as a laboratory for training young people in environmental science and environmental policy and environmental careers. We then have very specific off-ramps to that. So we're going to be establishing a native plant nursery where we want to grow many of the plants we're going to be installing, and then hire local people to get certified and trained so that they can be the ones growing the plants that are then sent to their own community. We'll then have to maintain all of that land. And so we're creating a stewardship endowment, and we'll be hiring a long-term steward and trying to then set that steward up to train local people to be environmental managers for the wetlands in the community where they live. And I'm so glad you bought a house in Holland's Market, just outside of my district, but I encourage you to come down to Pigtown Main Street, check out the new Ethiopian restaurant there. It's amazing. And in terms of EPA, we've had a fantastic relationship with Region 3. We just had did a terrific site tour. We had a bunch of the Region 3 team come down from Philadelphia. If I had known to invite you, Dominic, I would have invited you on the boat to go toward the Middle Branch. Why don't you reach out, and I'm glad to drive you around and talk about involving the EPA. I see another question about how local communities were involved. This has been a long-term effort. We've spent the past 3 to 5 years engaging local communities. The Reimagine Middle Branch plan I talked about started with a year-long process where we had the communities themselves pick the design firm that they wanted to work with and interview various globally important design firms. And the community ended up with the folks who designed the High Line. They said, we want to work with that quality of landscape architect. And then we went through a multi-year process of engaging the community, of having everything from in-person meetings to online meetings to showing up at existing community meetings to holding ice cream socials and free kayaking events. So it's been a very long process. And in terms of vacant homes, we want to also be very sensitive to the positive. We want to do 2 things. One, we want to harness these improvements to generate investment in Baltimore, but we also want to be very sensitive to the idea of gentrification. And so later on this summer, we already spent $900,000 investing in our local community development corporations so they could begin to get out and buy property in advance of gentrification. We're going to be rolling out a $5 million fund later on this summer to provide project funds, gap financing funds for them to go do those projects. And I would say that in terms of engaging the local community, the really important thing is not to come in and tell a bunch of people, you should want to go kayaking, because that will inevitably fail. What you should do is start with where they are and what their priorities are. And if their priority is fixing the bench in the local park that's been broken for 3 years that they've been calling about and no one's paid attention, you work on that. And then you fix the basketball hoop and you build up trust and shared mission and your own credibility to the point where you can begin to say, all right, now that those fires have been put out, what about the fact that this neighborhood has been divided from its own waterfront? How can we help you solve that? So it is 1:55. I think my time is up. Is that right, Matt?
Yes, just about. I think we had.
You can do a few more questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, okay. So Glass Beach is definitely the glass factory is definitely part of the plan. And in the not too distant future, assuming that things don't assuming that things the other way we're planning, that site will be a waterfront mixed income housing project as part of the One Westport development. And planting fruit trees and shrubs, we haven't gotten yet to the point of site-specific interventions like that. We are, the wetlands will not be fruit-bearing trees. Those are going to be native grasses that are, traditional ecological habitat. But certainly we've invested a lot of money into community gardens and things like that and orchards. And I can totally see that being a part of the final site designs. Oh yeah, will green lots be invested in to turn into green spaces or local playgrounds? So yes, we have not been focused right now on vacant lots to be pocket parks, because we've been more focused on building up the strong assets which are already in the communities which are underinvested in, like Carroll Park, like Florence Cummins Park, like Solo Gibbs Park. Those are the primary assets the community looks to, and we want to make sure they are wonderful. And then we want to move from there to things like pop-up parks in vacant lots. I would say that this project is really fun and really amazing, and that if anybody, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and if anybody wants to come by and do a driving and walking tour of the Middle Branch, they can reach out to me directly, and I'm glad to share time with anybody.